Now we have a sense as to these two very important sources of instability in the world, namely the issue of anocracies and failed states. But now let's take a look at some of the manifestations of those frictions and conflicts in the form particularly of war and terrorism. You see, during the 19th century and also the 20th century, wars between states were the dominant form of armed conflict in the world. In the 21st century, what we're witnessing is new forms of violent conflict in the world. Because in fact, as we shall see in a moment, wars either within countries or between countries are down in terms of their frequency, but at the same time, other forms of political, ethnic, and religious violence, especially terrorism, are on the increase. Let's take a look at the numbers. Here we have a chart from the Center for Systemic Peace that shows us for every year since the end of World War II, the number of active wars, either within countries, those are called civil wars, which is the blue line on the chart, or wars between states or between countries, which is the red line on the chart. It's very clear that the tendency over the last 30 or 40 years has been on the decline, especially since the end of the Cold War. This particularly affected the number of civil wars in the world, in Latin America, in Central America in particular, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in parts of South and East Asia. If you remember, competition between the United States and the Soviet Union often led to local conflicts in the form of civil wars around the world. So this is a welcome trend, but unfortunately, as we all very well know, over the last 5 or 6 years, since the beginning of the Arab Spring, we've seen a slight increase in the number of civil conflicts around the world. One of them, the Syrian conflict, of course, with major repercussions for the Middle East and for Europe. As of the end of the year 2015, I think we should all congratulate ourselves in that there are no registered wars between states or countries in the world, which is, of course, a very welcome fact. Now, the bad news comes when we consider terrorism. Here we have an indicator of the frequency and the gravity of terrorist attacks in the world, which is the number of victims from terrorist attacks, starting 20 or 30 years ago and running all the way to the middle of the year 2016. And it is very clear that the beginning of the 21st century marked a new era in terms of terrorism in the world, beginning, of course, with the 9/11 attacks here in the United States. A very dangerous aspect of this upward trend in terms of the impact of terrorism around the world, as measured, for instance, as you can see on this chart, by the number of victims, has to do with the concentration of this phenomenon in just a few countries around the world, including those in the Middle East, but not only those, also Russia, India, and so on. One very important implication of civil wars and terrorism is the growth in the number of people who are displaced from their places of residence. Let's talk about refugees and displaced populations. The difference between refugees and the displaced is actually very simple. The term refugee is mostly used in the case of international displacement. That is to say, people who are forced because of conflict to move from one country to another. Whereas the term displaced is used in the context of forcibly moved populations within a particular country. As we can see on the table here, the recent conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq displaced millions of people within their country and also internationally as refugees. The Syrian conflict that started in the year 2011 in the wake of the Arab Spring has so far displaced about 4.2 million people, many of which are international refugees. Now, while it is true that the displacement of people as a result of World War II was much bigger in scale, reaching about 15 million affected, or also the partition of India or the crisis in Bangladesh at the beginning of the 1970s. Over the last 20 or so years, the numbers of refugees or displaced people in the world has grown very quickly. At the present time, there are about 15 million people in the world who are either refugees or displaced. And that is not only a human tragedy, it's also very costly, especially to the countries that receive those immigrants.